Anxiety management. This can be achieved with deep breaths, as it takes your mind away from the stress. Focusing on breathing can be calming, and lack of oxygen can cause an individual to feel lightheaded, leading to irrational thinking. So deep breaths can be effective in reducing anxiety moments before exercise. A warm-up can also help. When anxious or stressed, your muscles usually tend to tense up, so warming up not only helps with preparing you for exercise, but can also relax your muscles, making you feel less tense and therefore less anxious. Another one is practice. Practice can lead to gradual improvement. As you get better, you will gradually become more confident in your exercise, leading to a reduction in anxiety. Limitations of these techniques. The problem with warming up and practice is that these techniques are good for reducing or preventing anxiety, however fail to help in the moment. A warm-up is not going to help during a football game whilst you're stressing about being 3-0 down. Usually a lot of kit or equipment is also required for these stress-reducing techniques. Therefore, these also cost money, which isn't good if you suffer from anxiety, but are also low on money. Types of stress. Stress has been described as a negative psychological state or psychological response occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their own well-being with demands they may not be able to meet. Therefore, there are two different types of stress, one being eustress and the other being distress. Eustress is a form of stress that can give a very strong feeling of fulfillment and is usually experienced by athletes who seek a challenge or love challenges. Distress is different in that it is a bad form of stress and is described as an extreme form of anxiety as a result of perceived inability to meet demands. With eustress, it can aid focus and attention and increase intrinsic motivation. An example of this could be taking on a black slope when skiing. You're good at skiing but have never attempted this before, but you know you'll feel good after accomplishing the slope. However, on the other hand, we have distress, which derives from an environment that is perceived as threatening by the performer. For example, having to climb a rock climbing wall with work colleagues in front of a crowd for a charity. However, you fear heights and are also fear big crowds, so this causes bad anxiety as the individual perceives this demand as impossible, which induces the distress. Causes and symptoms of stress. There are many causes of stress, but the main ones are grouped into either internal, external, or personal. Internal causes consist of illness, which make you less able than you usually would if you were 100% well. Like, for example, if you were able to perform well enough, or worrying about being able to perform well enough, could induce stress, as you may not be able to meet the demands. Lack of sleep can also cause stress, as a lack of sleep can decrease performance and therefore induce stress and cause irrational thinking. Being a perfectionist could also cause stress, because for a perfectionist everything must be perfect, obviously, and this is obviously going to cause stress, as nothing can ever be completely perfect. External factors consist of negative social interactions, for example arguments with mates, so your mind may be with other places other than sport, as you value your friendship over this. Major life events like weddings can also take your mind away from other things and cause stress. And then obviously day-to-day hassles like having enough money for meals in the day. Symptoms and stress. There are two types of nervous system involved in causing symptoms of stress. One is the sympathetic nervous system and the other is the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system controls for fight or flight and can cause increased metabolism, causes blood to divert to muscles, increased adrenaline, increased heat production, increased breathing rate and heart rate. The other system is the parasympathetic nervous system and controls for decreasing breathing rate and heart rate, slowing metabolism, decreasing body temperature, and relaxing muscles. Stress in sport. The two main factors of stress in sport are the importance of the event and the uncertainty that surrounds it. There are also four main stages involved with stress in sport. For example, stage 1 consists of the demand you've been given, for example, a penalty kick in a cup final of football. Now, stage 2 is your actual perception of the demand. Is this penalty kick going to be a challenge I'm willing to take on, or is it a threat towards my well-being? If I miss, will it bring shame upon my teammates or by supporters? This leads us to stage 3, where depending on the perception of the demand is the type of stress you experience. If it were viewed as a challenge, you will experience eustress. However, if it was viewed as a threat, this could cause some distress towards the individual in taking the penalty kick. If eustress is created, it can aid the focus of the individual and increase intrinsic motivation, taking one for the team, resulting in increased performance. However, if the penalty was viewed as a threat, distress is experienced, which causes bad anxiety as the individual perceives this demand as impossible, which induces the distress and therefore reduced performance, possibly missing the penalty. The theory of planned behaviour. This states there are three main components involved in creating the intention of starting exercise. First one is attitude, and this is the first component, in which is stated to be your actual attitude towards starting exercise. It is positive or negative, wanting to start or not. The second component is subjective norm, and is associated with the social norms surrounding the exercise, whether these be positive or negative, like stereotypes surrounding netball as a girls' sport, which would obviously be a negative. The third component is perceived behaviour control, and in creating the intention of starting exercise, and is simply the difficulty surrounding taking up the exercise. For example, if it were expensive to take up and the individual hadn't a lot of money at the current time, this would be a negative. The outcomes are then reviewed, positive or negative, and whichever side the outcome leans towards creates the intention towards starting exercise. The evaluation of the theory of planned behaviour. In our study, we found 100% of people said that if all three components of the health and belief model were present, attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behaviour control, they would most likely take up the exercise. This supports the theory in that the theory suggests that all three components must be set in place for the individual to carry out the exercise. Although participants said they would take the exercise on, if all three components were in place, 100% of participants also said they would be incentivized by their attitude alone. This model can then be criticized in that it fails to suggest why and how some people take on exercise despite negative subjective norms or negative perceived behavior control. Another theory would be the trans-theoretical model. It has a few components, the first being pre-contemplation. This is when the person is unlikely to engage in sport and defensive about change. The second component is contemplation, where the intention of change is present, and sometimes the individual will know that a change is needed. The third is preparation. This is getting ready to engage, for example, a 10-day countdown before starting exercise. Action is the fourth, and this is when you are currently exercising, but motivation must be maintained. Maintenance is the next, and this is when behaviour has changed and participating in regular exercise but goals or extra steps must be set in place, otherwise behaviour will relapse without motivation of reaching the next step or goal. The last step may or may not be termination, where the behaviour is given up and the individual tried it and didn't like it. Evaluation of the trans-theoretical model. 75% of participants in our study have said that they have contemplated starting exercise. This suggests the majority of people have the motivation to accept an intention of change. However, only 25% remain in the pre-contemplation stage. This supports the theory in which the beginning of all exercise starts with stage 1 and 2 of the trans-theoretical model. However, this theory can also be criticized. This is because 100% of participants said they would not tell friends and family to consolidate the intention of starting exercise. This suggests the theory fails to explain how people consolidate their intentions in starting exercise, or if consolidation is even relevant in the first place, which questions the model's overall accuracy. Another model or theory being the health and belief model. This has three main factors, and the first one is perceived susceptibility. The first part of the model and is an individual's perception of the likelihood of developing a condition. The second part being perceived benefits. It is the second part of the theory and is suggested to be a person's perception on how severe the individual would view the impacts of a condition on their ability to exercise. And the third being perceived barriers is the last component and is the individual's assessment of the difficulties involved in taking proposed actions to increase their ability to exercise. This has been evaluated in that all participants on our study answered that they all involved themselves with sport. However, only 75% had the knowledge that when you do not exercise, your chances of developing a condition will increase. However, only 50% of participants had perceived barriers, suggesting although they know the dangers of not exercising, they still have perceived difficulties involved in taking proposed actions. This supports the theory in that all the majority of the four perceived factors must be positive in order for exercise to be maintained.